Welcome everybody to our presentation. This is our first of the America 250 Town Hall series that's being sponsored by Windham World Affairs with a grant from the Vermont Humanities Council. We're pleased to be working with Meg Mott for, the next year or so, putting together quarterly town hall meetings such as this. So today we're going to be talking about, is it constitutional to abolish homelessness and encampments? Okay, looking at what's happening with that. After this meeting, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of ideas that people are going to have, further discussions you're going to want to get involved in. This presentation that we're doing tonight is part of work that we're doing also with Compassionate Brattleboro. There's a flyer that's on the table you might have seen around town. And Compassionate Brattleboro is going to have a community discussion on May 28th here at the library as well. And that's a Tuesday from 6 to 7:30. So Meg will be here, so will Paul Rodriguez, Sarah. So if people want to continue this discussion, we definitely have a place for it. Okay, so May 28th. Another thing that we have coming up with Windham World Affairs Council, and we work as part of the World Affairs Council of the Americas, where we bring an international perspective to all the different ways that we live. We're going to be talking about the sanctions response to Russia. And we have a doctor coming in from New England Law in Boston, Christine Abolish, who's also an author, and she's going to be talking about Ukraine and Russia sanctions. What does all that mean? So that's going to be Thursday, June 6th at 6:30. Okay, and that's at 118 Elliott, which is another place where we have regular meetings. We have a sign-up sheet on the table over there with some stickers for Windham World Affairs if people want to be on our newsletter and know about new things that are coming up. We have monthly meetings at 118 Elliott if you're interested in that as well for members. And so without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Meg Mott, and I just want to let you know the America 250 series is looking at celebrating our 250th anniversary of signing the Declaration of Independence, and that's coming up in 2026. So you'll start seeing it's a national movement. You'll start seeing this America 250 in many different ways. And Windham World Affairs Council is happy to present it here in Brattleboro in a way that can be a discussion, right? And not so much a celebration, but more of a critical view of what does it mean, right, to be 250 years here in this country with this Constitution. So, and I'm Tamara Sten, President of Windham World Affairs, and I want to thank everyone for being here.
Hi everybody, I'm Meg Mott. Thanks for coming out. Those of you who've heard me give talks here before know that I like thinking constitutionally. I think it's very lovely that we have a type of government in which we get to tell the government we're not happy with what they're doing because of the Constitution. How many places have that? So I find it very useful for having conversations about big policy issues. And I'm going to assume there's going to be strong disagreements on tonight's question, and it's the question in front of the Supreme Court. My mic is not picking me up. Let's see if I do something. Yeah. Okay. All right, now?
Yeah.
No? Now should I try it again? Yeah. Now I'm going to talk again? Oh. Should I go back?
No.
You heard what I said. It's very nice to live in a country where you can tell the government you're unhappy with what they're doing because it doesn't abide by the Constitution. It's kind of sweet. So, and unfortunately, I find that even though this is a tiny little document, and this particular version, let me hold it upright, actually includes the Declaration and the Constitution, so isn't that great? You don't have to spend that much time reading it. It's very short. I don't know that some of you have traveled, maybe you've lived somewhere. A lot of constitutions are very, very long. The reason is because they're modern states, and they have much more of an administrative approach. And so some constitutions go on and on and on and on because they're trying to anticipate every problem. Ours is very, very small because we're making it up as we go along with each other. Because we have principles, which are big words. We're not going to agree on what they mean. But these words help us as we make arguments when we tell the government, maybe not. We may not be right. So I want to put that out. I sometimes quote from the Constitution about matters, and nobody's persuaded. So it doesn't always work. But this manner that we go about things, which is principles, broadly defined, and the other word, and this is going to come out in the declaration, is form. And so I've asked Joyce Marcel, which means I need to get a mic to Joyce Marcel. Luckily, I know somebody with a mic. This is Allison Mott, everybody. Very good mic lady. So I've asked Joyce, and before you start, to read the Declaration. Why the Declaration, not the Constitution? It's because the Declaration is what was written 1776, and the minute those words were written and promulgated, all sorts of people used them to tell the government, you're making a mistake with what you're doing. First, just a little bit of history. 1776, July, it is published, and by January 1777, Prince Hall, who lives in Massachusetts, who's the head of the African Lodge, is using the Declaration to make a case against slavery in Massachusetts. Eventually he's successful. 7 months out of the gate, he's doing it. In 1848, suffragists, Seneca Fall, they used the Declaration in order to make a case for women's rights. They changed it a little, and when Joyce reads it, we'll get into the details. They do make some changes. In 1970s, the Black Panthers used this sentence from the Declaration in their 10-point program. So this sentence sets the tone for how we understand the Constitution. I think of it as an acorn, and the Constitution is an oak, but this is kind of small for an oak. So I was thinking about this before coming, and maybe what it is the Declaration is a compass, and the Constitution is the map. So that's what I'm going to put out there. So what we're going to do is a little civics. We're going to think about what that sentence is in the Declaration. What are these principles? Then we're going to talk a little bit about what is a possible form. The form that we come up with is the Constitution, but I want to talk about that. And then we're going to get very Supreme Courty in our thinking. The little brochure that I passed out, I'm hoping that there's enough to go around. Oh, and Allison is finding more of them. Is that true, Allison Mott?
Well, I'm folding.
So if somebody's bereft and you don't have a little brochure, we can get you a brochure. Because in that brochure, we're going to go over the facts of the case currently before the Supreme Court. It has not been decided. It will not be decided until June. But I always think, isn't this great? We get to hear the oral arguments. We're going to hear 3 different arguments on this question. Are bans on homeless encampments a violation of the 8th Amendment? So we're going to get into that question. And then we'll see how we think about this. Like, what do we think the Supreme Court's going to do? Okay. Joyce, are you ready?
Yeah.
Would you be willing? And so as Joyce is reading, and if you think I missed one, let me know. I'm going to write down the principles. What are the principles that we can use in order to say that we think the government may be wrong?
Okay. Declaration of Independence. Can everybody hear? Yeah. Right. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Can we just stop one moment? Anybody know what pursuit of happiness is? Yes, Steve. Can we get a mic to Steve? Oh, really?
I can talk about it.
Steve is going to yell. Yeah.
It's a substitute for the word property.
True, because who wrote Life, Liberty, and Property? This is an exam. Are you prepared?
Yeah,
Anybody know the answer
Locke.
to this question?
Locke.
John Locke. John Locke. Okay, yes. But they didn't do life, liberty, and property. They said life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. What does it mean, Steve?
Well, I feel as though what Jefferson's doing is he couldn't say property because it was clear that not everybody had property, especially slaves. And so he had to find something else that it was safe to say.
Okay.
And I think the sneaky part in there is the word pursuit.
Oh, wow. And somebody's nodding too when you're saying sneaky. Remember, these are our rights that we use to tell the government that maybe they're not doing the right thing. Can somebody else give me something? Poor Steve. I'm not always the kindest teacher. Yes, and what's your name?
Esther.
Oh, Esther, yes.
Yes. Would the pursuit of happiness be freedom?
Would be freedom. I mean, that does seem true, because we have rights or life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Something maybe having to do with freedom that doesn't have any sneakiness about it, but freedom.
Because you're free to pursue what makes you happy.
Free to pursue what makes you happy, absolutely. Anybody else? Marceline, is that your name?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Self-interest.
Self-interest. Oh, do say more.
Well, like, for selfish reasons or not selfish reasons aside, which is what could be happiness, is to go after what you're looking for, and like whether that be property or the means of production or whatnot, but to fulfill your goals in life.
And if we were thinking about Marx and thinking about means of production and that sort of thing, that would make sense. Can I put you on the spot, Marceline?
Sure.
She was my student at Marlboro College. Remember that place? Okay, guess what? It was not Marx they were thinking of. It was Aristotle.
Well, whoa. I wasn't suggesting that they were thinking of Marx. I was just saying, like, you could interpret this in so many ways, but
Yeah. And especially since Marx was after. Yeah. You want to say anything about Aristotle?
I guess fulfilling one of Aristotle's definitions of people was to fulfill one's function, and to live your life was happiness, to live your life fully, completely, to fulfill the kind of role and to get to sort of the ends of what you're doing, the purpose and the whys of why you're doing what you're doing, more than mere survival, but actually enjoying thriving.
Thriving. Okay. Fabulous. That is Aristotle. It's not about feeling good. It's not about having things that make you good necessarily. It's about having the kind of life that you become a better person. And it has all these virtues attached to it. Yes, next to Marceline, what's your name?
Aiden?
Aiden.
Is this on?
Yeah.
Whenever I have questions about the text of the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution, I find that often the answers are based in some sort of grievance that the authors had with their government a few years ago. So I can't give an answer, but I can say where I would look for an answer to, like, what is the pursuit of happiness is, what right did the authors feel they needed to endow themselves with that they didn't previously have?
Beautiful. So great. Some people, okay, I have been known to say that the Declaration was written by criminals for criminals. Because if they didn't win, their heads were going to be on pikes. And cruel and unusual punishment is one of the things that they are very angry about, that King George is doing. So there's lots in the Declaration of what was he doing wrong. And that's the way to look at it. So cruel and unusual punishment is one of those things. I'm just going to push a little bit more on this very idea. Pursuit of happiness is a lot about becoming a better person. And isn't it interesting that in these old state constitutions, Vermont is included, that what were they telling people? If you want to be a free society, to have what Esther says, to have freedom, you had better, this is what Vermont says, you had better be moderate, temperate, frugal, just, and industrious, and there may be one other. So there was this understanding that happiness was actually building inner strengths. Laura?
Where does educated come in?
Well, that we need to have an education that makes this kind of pursuit possible.
The virtues possible.
The virtues possible. Yeah, thank you very much. Joyce, are you ready to pick it up?
Yep. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness.
Okay. That's a big one. Right to alter and abolish. The right to revolution is in there in the Declaration. And that's what the next town hall will be in September, is this right to alter and abolish. That's how big our rights are. The right to revolution is just put in there. And we get happiness for the second time. But we also get safety. These are hard principles to try and wrestle. And our discussion tonight, and it's going to be one of the things the Supreme Court is wondering about, how do you increase people's safety? And that means everybody's safety. Those who are housed and those who are unhoused. Those who rely on public parks and those who have their own parks, called backyards. And that we have to somehow balance public safety, and then this other idea, this crazy idea, is that we get to become the kind of people we want to be. Not how our neighbors think we should be up to a certain, I mean, there's going to be laws against certain things that maybe everyone will agree on you can't do, but this basic idea of individual autonomy, individual freedom, that's in there. So here's all our principles that we're going to need to keep in our mind. And that some of them aren't going to sit neatly together. Woohoo, we say, because that's just what a self-governing people does. We get to have that. So now I just want to focus briefly on form, and that goes to this idea of, and there's a new book out, it's called The Pursuit of Happiness. It's by Jeffrey Rosen. He runs the National Constitution Center. It's a lovely book, and it gets into all those virtues, and how it was necessary to be a virtuous person in order to be a citizen in a self-governing community. And then they designed the type of government in such a way so those self-governing functions would be at the forefront of our mind. So we think of it maybe as legislative, and we've got some legislators here, or executive. I don't know, do we have any executives here? Maybe, of the library. And judicial. Do we have any judges here? Nope. So we're going to have to be up close. Judicial. And we may understand this in terms of separation of powers, checks and balances. There's a whole other way to think about this. And this is how they were thinking about it when they designed the Constitution. The legislative function, its whole purpose, is to increase understanding. Meaning, now I'm looking at my legislature. The whole point of the legislative process is you get enough different people having opinions on one policy and having different experiences with that one policy that the understanding is increased. That's the role of the legislative branch. The executive branch is the one who then is able to act, which means it's made a decision, it's the brain's will. Isn't that great? First of all, we get understanding. This is like government when it works. All this understanding, then the executor can move forward and act, enlightened action. And then here, and this is what I'll look at, will I make Joyce mad? Here's the judicial branch, and this is the conscience. The Supreme Court is the conscience. Why? And I know that's a very scandalous thing to say nowadays. The Supreme Court is the conscience. It functions as that because it is relying on the Constitution, the principles, these noble ideas, and that's how they're reaching their conclusions. So, that is how we're supposed to be thinking of this government we have. Like, go legislators, you've increased our understanding. If that's not happening, we should be, go Supreme Court. And I, again, I'll put my neck out there. It's the only function, it's the only branch of government that is currently functioning. I knew that would go over well. The reason why is because they're still using the Constitution, they're going through a process, and when we go through this case together, I'll ask you, were they using constitutional reasoning? Were they relying on those principles? Were they actually considering different points of view? And so the Supreme Court is the conscience, the President is the will, and Congress is our understanding. And then just to make sure that we don't get too worried, because you never want to see too much power in one place, and then we have a federalist system where the states have a lot to say. And it's going to be clear when we get to talking about homelessness, the states have a lot to say. Because generally that comes out of their police powers. Even before we had a constitution, this is the sort of legislation the states were doing. Okay. Shall we turn to this case? Because this is pretty exciting. The Supreme Court is considering the morality, the conscience around homelessness. And it's not as if it's totally new, because as we'll see, the Ninth Circuit started doing something like this in, I think, 2018, 2019. But here we have the Supreme Court is saying our conscience now needs to consider the issue of homelessness. So, everybody get one of these. I'm tempted, but I know I have to keep track of time. Before we go into the facts, I'd always love to get, just to read from the audience. The question is, could you imagine any arguments in which bans on homeless encampments are a violation of 8th Amendment? 8th Amendment is cruel and unusual punishment. Before we get into the details, what do you think? Are there any? Aiden, yeah.
I think it all rests on the cruel adjective,
Yeah.
because it's not unusual. Certainly many people are subjected to similar punishments, but
Mhm.
cruel is a measure of magnitude. What's appropriate for one thing is inappropriate for another, and if you say that with our conscience, we say that this ought not to be a crime, then any punishment for it is disproportionate.
Mhm. So the cruelty, and Aiden, I want to make this down because I'm going to play a little game. We get 3 over here. We're going to have to come up with 3 on the other side. The no's. So one argument is bans on homeless encampments are cruel because it disproportionately affects some people. Is that what you want to say?
No, because it's like multiplying by 0. So if you'd say that the act that's being punished is not bad in any way,
Yeah.
then a proportional punishment is no punishment.
Got it. I love this phrase, multiplying by 0. That's a great one. Yes, we have a mic right here. And can you tell me your name?
My name is Brenda Overlap.
Brenda. Thank you, Brenda.
I got one, but I don't know if it's working.
Yeah, it is.
Okay. People believe money doesn't. And I'm a former homeless person, both in Phoenix and in here. I just recently got housed last November. There's a lot of stigmatism around homelessness, such as drug addiction, eviction, for whatever reason. And then there are people who have circumstances that they could not afford their rent, and they had to leave their house. People should be able to, as long as they are not bothering the community, not on somebody's property that they shouldn't be on, I don't think there's anything wrong with encampments. People living You know, as long as they pick up after themselves. I mean, I used to be homeless. I lived in Phoenix on the street. You pick up after yourself, and if you don't, you pay the consequences.
Yeah, Brenda, I'm writing this down. Thank you so much for that. People need, we're talking about, it's not that people are choosing this, people need to live somewhere, and sometimes that's on the street.
And we believe money doesn't.
Yeah. Any other on this one? If we come up with 3 over here, I'm gonna be asking for 3 over there, on this, on the negative side, yes. And can you tell me your name?
George Carroll, and those that know me know that I'm going to be playing devil's advocate here.
Well, I hope so.
The previous speaker talked about being able to camp in the park if they're not bothering anybody.
Yeah.
But maybe it bothers me to see people camping in the park. I want to be able to go to the park and enjoy it with my kids and not have to see people camping.
Thank you. So you started us over here. We've got now 1 over here. Homeless encampments are not a violation. Yeah, because I'm gonna want equal numbers. If we go to 1 on one side, we're gonna go on the other. And I'm gonna play my moderator's rule, which is if you've spoken once on a topic, then I'm gonna look for other hands. But I wanna make sure I get this one down here. So, they are not a violation. And George, you said it's because of access to public parks?
I'm not sure where we are in your notes on not a violation.
So,
We talked-
It needs to say
So,
bans on.
this is bans on homeless encampments are violations of cruel and unusual
So
on the
that
Eighth
one needs to
Amendment.
say
On
bans.
this side, we're gonna say homeless encampments are not.
Okay, now I
Does
understand.
that make sense, or should I phrase it differently?
It should say bans on homeless encampments.
bans,
I think that would.
Bans.
Does that work for
Yes,
everybody?
we need the bans.
Yes.
Thank you, Karen. Homeless encampment bans are not a violation of Eighth Amendment. And you saying it's because parks, weren't you making a case about parks?
I was saying that I should be able to visit my park without having to look at homeless people.
Public parks should be,
It violates my pursuit of happiness.
okay, yeah, no, absolutely. Public parks should be free of encampment. I got 2 over here. I was hoping to get 3 and then push for 3 over here. And I'm gonna be tough. I'm not saying you have to endorse these ideas, but we wanna get our brains ready for different positions so that we can see what the court says. Because it's not as if the Supreme Court isn't concerned about some of the things that George has raised. And I saw your name and I forgot your name. Kathy.
I just have a question
Mm-hmm.
about the word punishment.
Uh-huh.
Cruel and unusual punishment.
Yeah.
I don't know where that belongs, but it just seems that somebody has to do something wrong in order to be punished. And so I don't know where that stands there.
Right. And the Supreme Court, Kathy, you might be interested to know, was also wondering about that. The Eighth Amendment says, I think I wrote it down underneath the Declaration. Is somebody willing to read the Eighth Amendment?
I'll read it.
Thank you, Suzanne.
Excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted.
Right. It's an interesting little statement. I think it's even an incomplete sentence. I'm looking at my grammarians. It's complete? Okay.
Shall not be, what's it?
It's a complete sentence.
It's passive. Thank you, Esther. Second Amendment is about the same thing. It's a passive thing. I'm going to put this down, Kathy, because this question about punishment, is a ban on a homeless encampment actually a punishment, or is it something else? So let's just put that down, because it's going to come up in front of the Supreme Court. Is it a punishment? And you had your hand up.
Yes,
Can you tell me?
Kathy.
Oh, two Kathys. Okay.
Also for the devil's advocate side, I was thinking of the safety and happiness of the people who are not using the park as a place to camp. So there's both sides to that.
Yeah.
That was in is the first one?
Oh, we have a question whether this is different than this one. I would say maybe we're only at 2 at this one. Yeah. Esther?
Maybe for that side.
Can't hear you, Esther. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Can you
Amy?
hear me? So maybe it's a matter of where do you draw the line? So the library is a public place. Would people be allowed to sleep in the whatever floor in the library? Why or why not? And I think maybe it gets tricky in a park, you know, where are we gonna draw the line?
Yeah.
What activities are people doing? Where are they doing it on the playground?
Yeah.
So it brings up those questions.
Right, so then we get to go into what kind of, like, where do you draw the line? And it's going to be about, like, activities, what can be banned, what are norms, what's okay, what's not okay. The whole safety question is going to be over here. I'll take one more over here, Lynn.
I don't know where it goes,
Yeah,
but what about the government?
what about the
What
government?
about the government? What are they doing to help the situation? I
Ah,
understand that there's only one state in the
right?
country that has a right to shelter, and that's New York State. Why are we not doing something like that?
So, and
I
Lynn's
don't know where
question.
that goes.
So, about if you say that a ban on homeless encampments are a violation of cruel and unusual punishment, that could create some incentive for states to do something. That would be true. So, make states work. Okay. Can we get to the case? Is it right if we get to the case and then I'm going to go back to, you've already spoken? I want us to get to the case and then we're going to open it up to the conversation. So here you have, and if you turn your little brochure to open it up, open it up just once. This is rather complicated. Open it up just once and then you should see something that says the facts. And the facts are, and we'll just go over them briefly. An ordinance in Grants Pass, Oregon prohibits people from using blankets, pillows, or cardboard boxes for protection from the elements while sleeping within city limits. Now I wanted to say that one more time, because it's very important. Here's an ordinance in a very specific town. It's not about camping. It says nothing about tents. It says nothing about fires. Who was the person who was wondering where do you draw the line? Somebody had that question. Esther. In Grants Pass, the ordinance says, should you fall asleep with a blanket, a pillow, or a cardboard box within city limits, that is against the ordinance. So that is a fairly severe, perhaps, understanding. And the court is going to be super interested in all this. Like, oh, what if you're just like falling asleep and you wrap your blanket around it? Are you going to be guilty? Or are you only going after people that you see are unhoused? So that's the ordinance that they're looking at. Grants Pass, you should also know, has one shelter available to everybody. And within the city jurisdiction. There's other shelters outside the city jurisdiction, but within Grants Pass, they have one shelter, and that shelter is run by a Christian church, God bless them, and they have certain rules. You may not do drugs, you may not bring in weapons, you're encouraged to go to a Christian service, and you may not bring in pets. So there are shelters available, however, there are restrictions. And so I have a question here about what is the population of Grants Pass. I didn't write it down, I'm gonna guess it's around 40,000. Anyway, who knows? It's not legal, I don't care. Yes, Sarah, did you have a question?
Yeah, do you know when this ordinance was put in place?
Well,
Is it reactionary to this recent situation of homelessness, or has it been on grants past
it has
books for a while?
It has been on the grants pass books for a while because when, in 2018, the Ninth Circuit ruled that the Eighth Amendment prohibits the imposition of criminal penalties for sitting, sleeping, or lying outside on public property for homeless individuals who cannot obtain shelter, That's going to reinforce that. So in 2018, people who lived in Grants Pass saw what happened in the Boise, Idaho case, and this is Ninth Circuit, it's not the Supreme Court, it's only the Western states, and they said, I think we got a case. Based on what our ordinance is, and based on what the Ninth Circuit just decided, a group of unhoused individuals said, we think the government is wrong in Grants Pass. And so they filed a case. They had been fined under this ordinance, and they challenged it in federal court. Pretty great, I think. I mean, I love it. People use the Constitution to say, that's a problem. Yes, Aiden.
Is there any suggestion that the narrow wording of the law was intentionally intended to be defensible so that the municipality, if such a objection were raised, could say, no, it is not illegal to be homeless in Grants Pass. You're more than welcome to build a house out of straw or bricks or sticks, just not out of cardboard.
Wow, sounds like a children's story. I'm not going to say I understand the motives. That they had this law in the book. They were trying to do something that could solve what they saw as a problem. What was their whole reasoning? The lovely thing is we get to just look at what their words were, and these were the words they picked. Now I think they regret those words. I mean, we'll see what the Supreme Court does, but that's opening up a lot of questions. Really, you can't? Because this is what they said in 2018. The Eighth Amendment prohibits the imposition of criminal penalties for sitting, sleeping, or lying outside on public property for homeless individuals who cannot obtain shelter. That's what the Ninth Circuit said. And all of a sudden, cities across the West could no longer shut down homeless encampments the way they had prior to 2018. So why did they move on this in Grants Pass? They looked at what their ordinance is, they found people who were being fined, and they said, we're going to bring this to the Supreme Court. And the federal district court, you should just know this, issued a permanent injunction arguing that the ordinance violated the Eighth Amendment's cruel and unusual clause. So that's what the federal court said. And then Grants Pass brought it to the Supreme Court. So that was what they just heard in April. And if you open up your brochure, this was a pretty great oral argument. You can find these online for free. You go to Oyez. I mean, it's amazing. They went on for 2.5 hours. I've got a real soft spot for some of those justices. They are great at hypotheticals. They are great at pushing reasoning. Tanji Brown Jackson, Neil Gorsuch, they're both amazing. Really, it's worth listening to them. You may think, oh, I don't like their politics. You should watch them in action. They're like tennis stars. Okay, so if you open up, we're going to get each of the arguments. So we only did 2. We could say this would be Grants Pass. No, sorry. This would be advocates for the unhoused people. And we could say this one is the attorney for Grants Pass. Because Grants Pass has got obligations to keep up the parks. That we need to take these parks seriously. So Grants Pass is over here, and we have advocates for the unhoused people over here. But in this case, we have 3 advocates, and the third one is kind of like Goldilocks. It's U.S. attorney who comes in and gives their position. So we're going to have 3 different positions, and we'll see how close we were to the Supreme Court. So we'll start over here. This is the grants pass side. This is what George began us with. Like, why is it's not a good idea to bring in the 8th Amendment on this policy issue? So, Ninth Circuit was wrong, said the advocate for grants pass. Cruel and unusual punishment governs punishment, not conduct. Was that you, Kathy, who said punishment? Yeah, that's what the advocate said for grants pass. Our fines, I mean, the fines, if somebody can't pay the fine, then we work with them. We try and give them a place to live. It's not cruel and unusual. Most cities have $500 fines for things like this, like public urination, something of that sort, especially if you keep doing it. Yes, Aiden, what are you pointing to? When we get to it. This ordinance, says the grants pass person, this ordinance provides a way to get people out of unsafe living situations and into treatment. Now, and I'm getting some great faces over here. I just want you to know, great faces. I'm like, really? I want to say it one more time. The ordinance provides a way to get people out of unsafe living situations and into treatment. I just realized, I didn't know this from before. Portugal, which is usually held up as a great harm reduction country, they decriminalize all sorts of drugs in Portugal. It turns out Portugal's got this thing called the Dissuasion Commission. And people get hauled in front of the Dissuasion Commission, and there's a lot of coercive force in Portugal, and guess what those people are? Family members. They bring in family members, because everybody's living in Lisbon, and they'll bring in your grandmother, and this Dissuasion Commission convinces people who are facing down a fine, it's not unlike a rep panel that we have around here, and gives people a lot of incentives to go into treatment. And that's what the woman from Grants Pass, the advocate, said. This is actually a pretty good thing that we've got going here. We're trying to push people into treatment, and you take that away, they're not going to go into treatment. And this does raise a very interesting problem around consent.
Yeah.
And addiction. And what?
Is treatment punishment?
Is treatment punishment, asked George, and I think that's a very good question. Because there's some times where maybe, I don't know, I'm tempted to put somebody on the spot. There's times where people who are under coercion start to make decisions for themselves that may be better in the long run.
Why, does that assume that everybody needs treatment?
It is assuming that it is a mechanism for getting treatment.
Treatment for homelessness?
Treatment for drug use.
Which is a huge assumption. That's a huge
Actually, well, okay, when I'm playing the role of, you're going to see, I'm going to take everybody's role. Grants Pass, they're making a case. It's our coercion that gets people into treatment. It's our pushing people, you want to do this or you want to get a fine, that sometimes turns lives around. And that's the case they're going to make. And you know, we may not agree, but that's what the case she's going to make. And she also said Martin, and that's that 2018 11th Circuit. 8th Amendment prohibits any kind of fines for somebody who is sleeping or lying outside on public property. You cannot fine that. And the woman who was advocate for Grants Pass said, you've misconstrued the 8th Amendment. This decision requires the city of Grants Pass to allow all but one of its public parks to be used as homeless encampments. That seems like a reasonable thing to say. If the new ruling out of the 11th Circuit is you have an 8th Amendment obligation, you cannot take down all these homeless encampments, that means all these public parks will then become homeless encampments. And you just have to understand that. So that's what Grants Pass was saying. If that's the case, that's what's going to happen. Can I just do one more and then? And the other thing she said, since this decision, cities are struggling to apply arbitrary and shifting standards to the problem of homeless encampments. Cities don't know how to operate now. They used to be able to say, nope, you can't do this, we've got our park, park regulations. City of Brattleboro, you're not supposed to have a tent after hours. After that decision from the 11th Circuit, cities didn't know what to do. They held up their hands. It's too difficult. I don't understand the 8th Amendment. I don't understand punishment. I'm confused. And since then, we've seen a suspension of enforcement of these laws. So after that ruling out of the 11th Circuit, there was all of a sudden question. We don't even know how to enforce any laws now. We're not going to touch it. And so there's a backing off. Backing off. And that's not helpful, she said. We need more help. What is your name?
Mark.
Mark.
Back to the coercion part. Coercion is a mechanism that creates.
Sorry. Are you feeling coerced, Mark?
Coercion is a tool used to intimidate, which then brings on discrimination. So this class of people through coercion is being discriminated against.
Yeah, and she's not going to make that case, but we're going to get to that case over here. Absolutely, yeah. So she's making the case coercion can be useful, and that's one point. Maybe I should just let you know what the Supreme Court said after hearing all those arguments. And the first questions came from Justice Kagan. Justice Kagan said, sleeping is a biological necessity. People can't help but fall asleep. Your ordinance is suggesting that if somebody just randomly falls asleep, they can get hit with a $5 fine, $500 fine. And as Mark said, if you start discriminating who you're going against, like who's falling asleep, that seems like a problem. So Kagan keeps going, sleeping is a biological necessity. It's sort of like breathing. I mean, you could say breathing is conduct too. And for a homeless person who has no place to go, sleeping in public is kind of like breathing in public. Your statute says that a person can't take a blanket and sleep someplace without it being a crime. Seems like you are criminalizing status, the status of homelessness. So that's what Kagan is telling the advocate from here. Gorsuch, and now it's going to just get a little confusing. Gorsuch says, we don't have to do this on the 8th Amendment. Does Oregon have a necessity defense? Yes, Oregon has a necessity defense. If you were brought in for a crime, and you can tell the judge it was a matter of necessity. Who said this? Brenda. People need to live somewhere, and sometimes it's going to be on the street. So Gorsuch says, you don't even have to worry about the 8th Amendment. Every single person who gets picked up has a necessity defense. Does Oregon allow that? Yes, Oregon allows that. So, end of story. This doesn't have to even come before us. The other thing was, if Barrett is questioning a woman who says, coercion is a good thing. This is a mechanism that we have in order to get people into treatment. So Justice Amy Coney Barrett is very interested. Are you saying that if your law is enforced, there is a way for everyone to be cared for? Because do you see how, if you're going to start to have these kind of laws, you're going to have to give people somewhere to go. And what if the law said it is unlawful and punishable by 30 days in prison to have the status of homelessness? What would you have us do then? And the advocate for Grants Pass says, oh, I don't know. Justice Barrett is saying you don't want to just criminalize homelessness as a status. You can't do that. So this is like, I'm hoping that you're starting to say, ooh, that was a Trump appointee who said that. But that's what her concern is. Okay, is there anything else? Yeah, so those are the three that happen. The next person who comes before the court is the U.S. And the U.S. guy, he's representing the U.S. government, and he is saying, so you'll find that in the center there, and I love this kind of stuff. Our narrow submission in this case is that the government cannot circumvent the 8th Amendment principle by making it unlawful for a person to reside in the jurisdiction if he has the status of homelessness. You cannot, in any jurisdiction, the United States government is going to be very clear on this, you cannot in any jurisdiction make it impossible for a homeless person to live there, just because they're homeless. You can't engage in pushing people out of a town. So that's the United States position. However, that's why I call this the United States' Goldilocks. Homelessness as a status should not be criminalized. Cities should have flexibility to implement time, place, and manner restrictions. This is also what Brenda said. You got to pick up the trash. Could there be other time, place, manner restrictions? You cannot shoot up in public. You cannot leave your needles in public. You cannot poop in public. You cannot urinate in public. And so the United States said their position is you cannot criminalize sleeping, that's the conduct, outside if the protection against the elements is not available. You cannot do it.
You have to go to a shelter.
You have to go to a shelter.
Well, aren't they saying pillows?
What?
Pillows and blankets are allowed.
The United States says you can have a pillow, you can have a blanket, you can have a cardboard box. But if you are offered a shelter, you gotta take it. If you are offered a shelter, you gotta take it. And so, that's kind of a big deal, because you may say, you can come in the shelter, we'll take you there, everything will be fine. And one of the people who were in this case had a dog, and the shelter, I think I mentioned the Christian shelter, will not allow you to have a dog. She said, I'm not going to go there. And so she was penalized. And the United States, when asked about these sort of questions, let's see what kind of questions they got. Let's say that there's not a shelter within the town limits, but there's a shelter that's 10 minutes away. Can a town say, we'll take you to this shelter, you can go to this shelter, we'll take you there. Is that okay? Or does the town have to take care of everybody within the jurisdiction? The United States wasn't so sure. What about the idea, as this is Chief Justice Roberts asking these questions, what about the idea that poor laws say that communities have to take care of its own residents? And it is common now, as it was at the founding, for churches and individuals to offer help. The charity is in the community. If there was that kind of a service available, would the United States government be behind it? Like, could you have those kind of shelters available? The United States government says, sure, any kind of shelters will be fine with. And then, what is, Justice Gorsuch wanted to know, does an alcoholic have an 8th Amendment right to sleep outside even though there is a bed available in a shelter that does not allow alcohol? Because if you are an alcoholic, says Justice Gorsuch, wouldn't that suggest that you don't have that kind of capacity to restrain from alcohol? And if you're offered a shelter and the shelter says, no, you can't drink, what are we going to do then? And so the United States government, I mean, these are big questions. I don't know. So can we move to the final one? The final one is arguments from Johnson. And it gets a little confusing because besides that 11th Circuit ruling that I've been talking about, in which they said you cannot criminalize people for sitting, sleeping, or lying outside, there is another case. We may have principles, but these principles are illuminated by all this case law. So there was another earlier case that's very important for this oral argument. This last little bit of detail. And it was a 1962 California case called Robinson. And in California, it used to be that if you were addicted to drugs, you were a criminal. It wasn't the conduct, it was the status. Just to be addicted in California, you could be penalized. And the Supreme Court, it was Justice Potter Stewart, he said, nope, you can criminalize conduct, you cannot criminalize status. And so the advocate who was working on this side, She said what that ordinance is doing in Grants Pass is criminalizing the status of homelessness. And based on what the court has already decided around drug addiction, this is what's going on here. So that's why it's Robinson's holds that status-based punishment schemes are categorically cruel and unusual under the Eighth Amendment. And that's that idea multiplying by 0. You take a person who's in a certain circumstance who has a status, and then you keep putting fines on them? No, you can't do that. The ordinance makes it physically impossible for homeless people to live in Grants Pass without facing endless fines and jail time. And then, all the ordinance does is turn the city's homelessness problem into someone else's problem by forcing its homeless residents into other jurisdictions. So that was her argument, the advocate for the unhoused people. And let's just find out what the court says to her. And the court was trying to figure out, okay, so conduct status distinction. This is Chief Justice Roberts. We're having trouble because what the Supreme Court is trying to do is come up with a rule that everybody can live with. They're hearing all these arguments and they have to come up with a rule. And the rule they're trying to figure out is it going to work analogically for that whole thing about saying you cannot criminalize addiction. And then you say we cannot criminalize the status of being unhoused. So they started to do their lovely thing with hypos. If you offer somebody a place to live in a shelter, but they can't bring their dog, is that person still unhoused? Or has their status changed because they've been offered a place in a shelter? Because if you're providing services and the person decides they don't want to go, is that going to be the same as addiction? So they went through all these hypos trying to figure out what is it when somebody's an addict or not an addict? What is it when somebody's homeless or not homeless? And then they had questions about, well, let's say there's a rule against public urination. This is Amy Coney Barrett. Let's say that in the ordinance there's this rule. You cannot pee in public. And in the same town, there's no public places to pee. And let's say all the businesses have decided to put codes on the doors, making it impossible for someone to pee inside. So is that now a violation of the Eighth Amendment? People have to pee. And so she's just asking the question, no commercial establishment will allow non-patrons to use facilities? Would the Eighth Amendment preclude laws against public urination? Could be if we go with this rule. You better have places for people to pee and poop. Does that make sense? Like that's kind of what the court has to come up with rules. And I think that's it. Yeah. So this is what we're waiting on. What will the court do? 2.5 hours, oral arguments. Can they even come up with a rule? Because if they come up with a rule that says cities can decide time, place, and manner of encampments, but by the same token, some of those ordinances could run afoul of the Eighth Amendment, that means cities are going to get sued. I don't know. Any thoughts? Aiden?
No thoughts, but 2 questions. I don't understand how the punishment argument even gets in the door, because if you say it's not punishment, it's a fine. The Eighth Amendment has the word fine in there. It prohibits fines too. And if you say it's not a punishment, we're just requiring you to be homeless in a different way, they clearly don't have the will or means to provide that way. So I don't understand how the punishment argument even gets in the door.
Can I answer that one first?
Sure.
God, you know what's so fabulous? The people who are on this side, they didn't use the excessive fines argument. They used the cruel and unusual punishment argument. And my guess is it's because of that 9th Circuit ruling that used cruel and unusual punishment.
All right. My second question is, what would happen if what's the town's name?
Grants Pass?
Grants Pass, said, we do not have fines for these activities. We have a $500 fee/tax for residents who use public spaces for overnight stays, just like we have fines and fees for people who park their RVs in a national park.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if you'll be able to pull that off, depending on what the Supreme Court does. And I should tell you, this whole thing could become a, I don't know, one of those series that has a terrible ending, because Oregon just passed the law, and Oregon state law now prohibits those kind of ordinances. So it may become a gnaw dog kind of situation, or dismissed improvidently granted is the terms they use. This whole thing may just disappear, which would make it less of a constitutional issue and more like a statute issue. And we'll find out. Yeah, I don't know. Laura had her hand up, and then we'll go to Steve.
Yeah, I've been thinking about conscience and the Supreme Court, and this side and that side. And it seems like if the public doesn't want to be bothered with encampments when they take their children to play in the park, there are children in encampments too, I guess. Yeah. And it's the contrast between the two populations, the two statuses, the housed and the unhoused, that awakens conscience. And protecting the housed from sight of the unhoused is a real way to diminish the role of conscience and awareness. I just wanted to interject.
Laura, thank you for bringing back the conscience piece. The minute that this becomes not a fine issue, but a cruel and unusual punishment issue, that changes the whole way the conscience is working. And that's what has now been opened up. That a lot of people are taking this very, very seriously, that certain basic functions, sleeping, breathing, peeing, pooping, are going to have to be handled in such a way that those basic needs are taken care of. Even at the Supreme Court, and I don't want to project what's going to happen here, but the fact that this genie is out of the bottle, that these kinds of ordinances could be a violation of the 8th Amendment, doesn't mean this is going to go away, regardless of what the Supreme Court says. And I think it's because it's asking all of us to think about it in the terms of conscience. Yeah, Brenda.
Me?
Yeah.
Okay. My thought is if you want to make things better, make more homes. You got a lot of abandoned buildings, abandoned homes. People, I don't know, like WWH, Groundworks, HCRS, whoever.
Yeah.
We could take a lot of them abandoned places and turn them into housing.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, they're not boarded up and they don't look like an eyesore.
Right, right. Yeah. And so this idea of people need a place to sleep, to rest, to pee, to poop, to breathe, I mean, those facilities should just be available as part of conscience. Now, we got to be clear, there's limited budgets. And also, and Brenda, you were so clear about this, you said you got to pick up your trash. What the Grants Pass person, the advocate for Grants Pass was saying, we're having a hard time having any norms in our city. And that's something that also needs to be worked out. Any norms. Like, we got to still have norms, and we're afraid that if we pass some ordinances, our norms, we're going to get hit with an 8th Amendment violation, but we need norms about not shooting up in public. We need norms about not having sex in public. And when people don't have places to have sex, we got to figure out some places where they're going to have sex where not everybody's watching. So how can we make that all happen? And that's the way to start to go.
Is norms another word for prejudice?
What do you think, George?
It can't be.
So George is saying, like, our norms prejudice. And
Our norms are that no black people should be walking on the street after dark.
So that was a norm, but it didn't go very far.
Went a long way for quite a while.
Went a long way for quite a while, but, you know, it didn't work eventually because we got those principles. And so,
A norm can be a predatory.
a norm, yeah. And I like your devil's advocacy. So are there ways to still have norms to protect these basic principles? I guess I want to say yes. Steve, been very patient.
Whatever you decide, the decision is drawing a line so that, okay, sleeping, breathing, peeing, pooping, sex.
Yeah.
Somewhere you draw a line and you say, that is not status, that is not necessary, that's an activity that you could control.
Yeah.
The same with the dog.
Right.
Okay, we've got to let your dog into the shelter.
Yeah.
But you with the camel, we don't have room for a camel.
Yeah.
That whatever you decide, you're drawing a line
Yeah.
that might disagree with where someone else would draw the line.
Exactly. And the Supreme Court, I'm so glad you raised that question, because one of the things that justices were trying to figure out, okay, eating is a natural function. Let's say you don't have any food. Can you really penalize somebody who steals food to eat? And the Supreme Court was asking that, because how far are we supposed to go with this? If we go really far, then all the people who are selling food are going to be very angry with us if we say there are no norms about stealing food in order to survive.
Or eating the flowers in the garden.
Whatever, yeah. You haven't spoken yet in the back. And can you say your name?
David, the Supreme Court's not obligated to play on the Eighth Amendment court. And I was wondering if, because I haven't followed the case that closely, if there was any discussion that suggested, you mentioned Gorsuch had an out, but I don't think it's going to work very well. But is there any discussion about avoiding that amendment altogether?
And was your name David?
Yes.
Yeah, David. I don't want to predict. But if I was the Supreme Court, I would start to get very nervous, like where will we go with this Eighth Amendment? Because it could be so big and such a big claim. And wouldn't it be easier if Oregon just passed a law and said, you can't pass these sort of laws? That means we don't have to get involved. Or we can use the necessity defense, which does have some problems, because it means somebody has to be brought in front of a judge, and what happens in the meantime. But yeah, do they want to?
Or states police power to regulate public health and safety.
Right. And I think that's why what the United States government said was very interesting. The United States government said homelessness as a status should not be criminalized. We can go that far. However, cities should have flexibility to implement time, place, and manner restrictions. Because the cities still need to set up certain ordinances and take care of other forms of safety concerns. So the Supreme Court is kind of like, the United States is saying, don't go too far, you don't have to go too far. Yeah, Tamara.
I'm wondering about underlying causes, right? Because it looks like we're all looking at the action, but what were the circumstances that led up to that action? That lack of access of resources, that inequality, that, all of the different things, traumas that are behind the root cause of the homelessness. Is there ever a place to address that?
The Supreme Court is looking for a law. They're looking for a rule. They're wanting us to understand how far the Eighth Amendment can go. So, yes, obviously, there's a lot of work that's been done on underlying causes, other ways to do other kind of policies. But the Supreme Court, they're concerned. They got to come up with a rule. Yes, Star. Oh, good. Is that CB trouble?
CT.
CT trouble. Thank you.
I got a couple things to say. Tonight, you said sending people to rehab for their drugs. Okay? Will you go to a rehab for your drug?
I have gone to institutions for help.
Okay. Coffee is a drug. Hershey bar is one of the highest drugs on a horse. Anything you do nowadays is a drug. If a person don't want to go to rehab, it ain't going to do you no good to send it. First of all. Second thing is, okay, we bring in these people in, the immigrants, we housing them, and we don't house our own people. The president bringing people from overseas and putting them in every state, and they can't, they give them their money, they pay them, and we can't help our own people.
And so your concern as well is that we need to take this 8th Amendment so that this basic care is provided for. Yeah.
And we all got some kind of drug, don't you?
You can all take the 5th, remember that, you got the 5th Amendment.
I do, I drink it.
Oh.
And I like ice cream, that's my drug.
But, Mr. Trouble, your main point about the coercive element, and a lot of people here were feeling like, is it really a good idea to coerce people into treatment? And we're not so sure about that. And I'm generally in that camp. I do not like, I mean, this is why I like the Constitution, because I like having these liberties and these freedoms. But I'd be lying to you if I haven't seen how sometimes a very coercive spot like the Vermont prison system has saved people. There's other stories out there, but some of the people who are still alive today, the prison got them to still be alive today. So I'm confused on this. Yeah, and we have another hand up. Marceline, is that who you're pointing to? Marceline, you're going to have to yell.
I just, I mean, I know that research is a part of what they're doing, but isn't there a lot of research done about how, coercion and addiction it doesn't really work to force people into giving up their addiction. There's research being done about this topic, no?
There's research on both sides, and I could put somebody on the spot. You want me to put somebody on the spot? Okay, we have somebody, Jeff Kane is in the audience. Allison, who is the mic? Is there an extra mic? Can we give it to Jeff Kane?
Might not need it.
Okay. Jeff Kane, you want to just explain?
I've been working in addiction medicine for 50 plus years, and there are not lately called recovery courts, where individuals who have been engaged in nonviolent criminal activity are given a choice of treatment or incarceration sometimes. And people with addiction need acceptance and understanding and compassion. They often also need accountability, and this therapeutic jurisprudence puts pressure on them to do the things that they might want to do anyway, but otherwise have trouble just carrying out because of how addiction has hijacked the primitive part of the brain to do certain unhealthy things over and over again. And drug courts, recovery courts have actually a very promising track record in helping people do better. And I also think of the story of a young man from Brattleboro who caught my attention in a parking lot to say, and I knew him very well but hadn't seen him for a while, that he had just spent 3 years incarcerated. And he said, boy, I'm glad it wasn't 2, because I probably would have gotten out and gone right back. So there is a place for coercion, and what Meg described as happening in Spain, where there's Portugal, thank you, where there's sort of like a large intervention with a lot of significant people, that interventions sort of work too.
Yeah. Maybe both and. I'm always a both and kind of person. Kit, you haven't spoken, and then we're going to start to wrap things up, and I'm happy to take questions afterwards. Kit.
Is this all right?
Yeah.
What I'm about to mention is too big, but since the 1960s, with my generation, the reason we have had such an increase in all these problems, they were there before the 60s, they've been there forever, but it exploded starting in the 60s. And basically, my generation changed the definition of family. And family is where you learn all the rules of behavior, you learn boundaries, and we wiped all that out and sent our children out there with no sense of boundaries, and they were lost puppies. And that, in my research, has been the absolute bottom line of how all this has gotten to this point.
And Keith Humphreys, who has done a lot of work in harm reduction, drug policy, he has a book out, I can't remember what it's called, Keith Humphreys, and one of his arguments is the family, and that's why it's working so well in Portugal. You bring the grandmothers and the aunts and the uncles, and people don't move as much as they do in the United States.
The biggest thing my generation did, I think, is we took something that was already in our culture and we exploded it. And that is, we removed marriage as a requirement, a structure for family. We endorsed and threw divorce up into the, it just was incredible increase. And the problem is, divorce is emotional trauma for children. And a lot of the emotional issues come from childhood trauma.
So there's lots and lots of explanations for why we're here, and I definitely would put family as something to consider. But for what we'll be looking for in June is what is the Eighth Amendment? How is it going to be read nationally? Up until now, the entire West Coast has understood the Eighth Amendment not defines cruel and unusual punishment as certain ordinances that make it impossible to fall asleep outside, to sleep outside, to sit and rest, and that those are the sort of ordinances that probably aren't going to be able to stay along. But we'll see. I don't know. I'm very aware of the time, but Lynn Martin hasn't spoken, so I'm going to go to Lynn.
And let's pass this in.
I just want to
It's
point
not
out
on.
here, when we're looking at this issue, that we're one step away from being homeless. And I remember, like, after the Second World War, when my father got out of the service, and we went back to the town, we didn't have a place to live, and they put up barracks on lots, which people didn't like, but they were wonderful. They saved us. So that's how the town helped us.
Yeah.
In that issue. And I think we have to remember that we're vulnerable.
Yeah.
All of us.
We've had a history where the government did those sort of massive housing. During the Depression, I just finished reading John Steinbeck's East of Eden, the government camps. You know, there was camps that were created, they were just willy-nilly camps that were created, people doing things for themselves, and then there were some government camps. Of course, you couldn't act out, you couldn't do drugs, you couldn't have sex in public. Sometimes people wanted to go to the willy-nilly camps. But the government camps gave families a place to stay, and, you know, could be time to do that again. So I'm going to just keep track of time because I know the library closes at 10 of 8. Thank you, Star, for letting us be here. Thank you, Windham.
Thank you,
Thank you, Meg. Thank you, Windham World Affairs Council. This is amazing. Thank you, Compassionate Brattleboro. And thank you, all of you Brattleboroans, for bringing your brains tonight. I really, really appreciate it. And we'll see you back here on the 27th, which is a Tuesday, not a Wednesday.
May 28th, community discussion.
Oh,
How do we
28th,
feel
yeah, the
about
28th, that's what I
homelessness?
mean.
6 to 7:30, right here. I will be there with Paul.